Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. If you had to pick one skill that characterizes the best forensic scientists, it might be curiosity. A driving curiosity to understand how things work and how people think, particularly how criminals think. Alec Johnson was a big fish in a small pond. He and his wife Judy owned a gas station restaurant on the edge of the Tyendinaga Reserve. The Johnsons were proud of their house, and especially of their shiny, finished floors. As things turned out, they were to be a forensic godsend. Usually, her husband locked the money in the house safe, but not tonight. Two rounders, each with long records of theft and robbery, figured Alex might have some money around the house. And as they drove that night, they had trouble on their minds. They reached the Johnsons' house around 5 in the morning. To hide their identities, one of them wore an Elvis mask, the other a ski mask. Ski Mask carried a Beretta .22 caliber semi-automatic, a mean little thing. Elvis wanted some kind of weapon too. Their plan was simple: crash into the house, scare the bejesus out of the couple, and beat it with the loot. Alec and Judy were awakened by the sound of their door being smashed in. Ski Mask demanded money, but Alec wasn't going to give up the money he and Judy worked so hard for, not to a couple of pipsqueaks in ridiculous masks. Elvis screamed, "Shoot him!" Meanwhile, Judy slipped down the stairs. Elvis said he didn't want to hurt her, he just wanted money. Because the banks were closed for Christmas, the briefcase brimmed with almost $10,000. The nearest house on the reserve was 15 minutes away. Alec Johnson had been shot 3 times. He was alive, but barely.
Something like this is really, really unusual. It's really unusual to have something this serious happen on the reserve. When I got there was a couple of Ontario provincial police officers there. Of course, they're called initially for backup because we didn't know really what we had. When I got there was 2 officers there protecting the scene. The ambulance had been there and gone.
The Tyendinaga First Nations police deal with keeping order and petty crimes. Given that this was a major crime, they called in the Ontario Provincial Police. Jim Eadie gathers the clues at the crime site.
Probably the most important point of any crime scene is the point of entry to the crime scene. Historically, in my experience also has been that part of the crime scene oftentimes holds the best evidence that'll be available.
This is the high-intensity part of the job. The bad guys are nervous, their sweat is running, their hearts are pumping. No matter how much planning they've done, this is where they usually slip up. 90% of the fingerprints Eadie finds, he lifts from the point of entry. Emergency crews were intent on rushing Alec Johnson to a nearby hospital. As a result, most of the prints were trampled and smudged. But on the stairs leading up to the bedroom, Eadie gets lucky. Partial prints from 2 different running shoes stand out beautifully against the Johnsons' clean, shiny hardwood floors. Eadie dusts them and photographs them. Eadie finds 3 shell casings. These will be sent to the Center for Firearms Analysis. In the kitchen, Eadie finds a strange chunk of wood. What's it doing in the house? It looks like it's been broken off something larger.
When I looked around the outside of the house, I saw a broken sawhorse there, and it appeared that one of the legs had been pulled off the sawhorse. And in this particular location, I could see footprints in snow leading to another sawhorse. And I felt strongly at the time that those were probably footprints connected to one of the suspects in this case.
Did you know that footprints are 50 times more likely to help an investigator than fingerprints? Neither did I. Well, that footprint was about to become Exhibit A. Back at the Johnsons', Eadie wants to make a cast of the print, but first he has to photograph it. Not an easy task given the brilliant white snow. But if he doesn't photograph it, he may find irregular details and funny little marks on the cast caused by wedges of mud or pieces of grass stuck to the shoe's sole. Eadie is a master on the subject of shoes. He even gives lectures about them at the museum. Which one? The Bata Shoe Museum.
No 2 things are made exactly the same, wear the same, break the same, or tear the same. And that applies directly to shoes. Even modern-day shoes in modern processing plants are all come off the assembly line with their various uniquenesses, oftentimes microscopic. But I came to the Bata Shoe Museum a couple of years ago, and I found some really interesting examples, or historical examples really, of evidence that people were aware of and collected and synthesized and processed evidence of footprints because of the number of examples of, shall I say, deception or attempts at deception by the design of shoes. One of the examples that we use here, the Aboriginal executioner's shoes, which are handmade again. The soles are designed with emu feathers on the bottom. So it's impossible to follow the footprints or to make any discovery about the person who was the executioner because there are no useful footprints to draw any conclusions from.
I guess you can understand Mr. Eadie is passionate about his subject. Eadie prepares to make his cast of the footprint. It doesn't help that the temperature is rising and the snow is getting softer. Usually, he uses dental plaster. It's exceptionally hard and records very fine detail. But plaster is too heavy for snow. So the material Edie uses is flour sulfur.
I very carefully take the sulfur and I carefully pour the sulfur into the footprint. And as you can see, you end up with what appears to be, and in fact is, a puddle of sulfur in the snow. But in fact, what's happened is the instant that the sulfur touched the snow, it hardened, just like that.
Judging by its treads, it looks like the kind of shoe an NBA point guard might wear, or a kid in the playground. You'd think that with all the running shoes around, somebody like Jim Edie would find it a curse. But because of the fierce competition among sneaker manufacturers, they're always changing their models, always coming up with new arrangements of swirls and circles and exotic soles. So different runs of shoes and different years have different patterns.
So I took my cast, the cast in sulfur, and I took it back to my office and photographed it. And I prepared two copies of the photograph, actually a scale-sized copy of the cast that I could work with. But I copied quite a number of copies in a smaller version. And these were for distribution to the investigating officers because the cast actually shows a very good overall view of the details of the bottom of the shoe.
It seems to match the partial footprint he found on the stairs leading up to the Johnsons' bedroom. Meanwhile, Alec Johnson was in serious condition, with bullet wounds to the chest, leg, and head. At 4 p.m. on New Year's Day, investigators got one hell of a present. A message turned up on the OPP's Crime Stoppers line.
In that break-in, the one where the guy got shot, you ought to be looking at two people by the names Pete Benedict and Frank Lanoux.
Usually on Crime Stoppers, it's thieves telling on one another. That's probably what happened in this case. There isn't a lot of honor in the criminal culture. Police can't find a listing for Frank Lanoux, but they find a Pete Benedict. The listing for Benedict is in Cornwall, about an hour's drive from the Johnsons. Lots of times, criminals live in one area and drive to another to do a job. But police have learned to spread their net a little wider. When Lewis and Detective Rick Myers pull up in front of Benedict's house, they see the red Pontiac, the vehicle Judy Johnson thought she saw as she fled her home. Inside, investigators find a bundle of bills marked in what seems like Judy Johnson's hand, and a Beretta .22 caliber handgun. Investigators find fingerprints all over the car. Benedict's prints are found on the driver's side, while someone else's prints are found all over the passenger side.
We recorded a velocity of 907.3 feet per second. This is the type of firearm that was submitted. It's a small semi-automatic .22 caliber pistol. It's made by the Beretta company, and it's clip loaded or magazine loaded. This is the magazine, and this fits into the bottom or the magazine well of the firearm. What I have here is on the left-hand side, you'll see a portion of a center fire cartridge case. And on the right-hand side, I have my test that I fired from a suspect firearm. And you'll see a small line running down. That's the prism line that separates these two through the microscope. But what I'm looking at is a portion of each. And this is what we call breech face marks. And if you look at these lines or striations, the way they run into each other, this would constitute a match. It was quite a simple matter in that particular case for me to match up the cartridge cases to that particular firearm.
But the fingerprints, the bundles of money, even the gun which matches the bullets found at the scene are circumstantial evidence. Investigators know a good lawyer could find explanations for all those things that would give Benedict a sizable loophole. They need to find the sneakers. But Benedict's closet holds no sneakers. The only sneakers in the room are a pair of brand new Filas Benedict is wearing, and the soles don't match the flyer at all. Maybe Benedict isn't the perpetrator. Frustrated, the investigators ask Benedict about Frank Lanoux. Benedict insists he never heard of him. As he gestures, investigators notice something glittery on Benedict's finger, a new ring. Benedict is asked to empty his pockets. Among the contents, they find a receipt, dated the day of the robbery. There's no tax on the purchase because as a native, Benedict is exempt from tax. The ring, it turns out, is from a jewelry store in a mall an hour away. On a hunch, investigators decide to check out the mall. Maybe Benedict bought more than just a ring. At the last shoe store in the mall, a clerk recognizes Benedict's photo. And yeah, he came in just before New Year's, was wearing a perfectly good pair of Air Nikes, hardly used. That's a $140 shoe, you know. And he buys a pair of Filas, which aren't as good, and he says to me, chuck the Nikes in the garbage. That's when investigators had another stroke of luck. Because of the Christmas holiday, the garbage hasn't been picked up yet. Edie checks the sneakers against the print, checking first for size. They match.
And we had now recovered shoes that could be linked clearly to one of the suspects. I could see very clearly that precisely this element of the shoe, that little piece of the shoe, has a cut on the end of it. And if I look across on the test impression of the suspect's shoe, exactly the same element has exactly the same little cut on the end of it. And I simply continue that process, in this case, marking 10 characteristics, 10 accidental characteristics that I can see in the test impression that are also found in the suspect's shoe. I also noticed that the general wear is the same on the suspect's shoe. I also noticed that it's exactly the same size and exactly the same pattern. And my conclusion is that no other shoe in the world would have created this mark on the staircase except the suspect's shoe.
The pieces were now falling into place. Based on what they now knew, the OPP arrested Frank Lanoux. He was fingerprinted, and his prints checked out against the prints found in Benedict's car. They matched, proving Benedict had been lying when he said he didn't know Lanoux. Well, you're probably thinking it's all wrapped up. Think again. Unless investigators could determine which one of the two perpetrators was the gunman, they might both walk. Judy Johnson had identified the gunman as the one wearing the ski mask. Was it Benedict or Lanoux's face behind the shooter's mask? The masks had been recovered the day after the shooting, a half a mile down the road, and sent to the Center of Forensic Sciences to be analyzed for DNA. DNA is the most revolutionary development of the century in forensic science. DNA is found in virtually every cell of our body, including hair, teeth, and all bodily fluids. Scientists had found traces of saliva inside the mask. These were analyzed by the lab and compared to samples taken from each of the suspects. One of the suspects, while being interviewed, had smoked a cigarette in the police cruiser. Not only is smoking bad for you, but your saliva is loaded with DNA. When they compared results, they now knew Benedict had worn the Elvis mask. By the process of elimination, Lanoux was the shooter. At the trial, prosecutors presented the masks, the gun, the casings, and the marked money, and the fingerprints in the car. All of this tied Lanou to Benedict, but it was circumstantial. It was this, Exhibit A, that clinched the case. The fact that their prints were found on the stairs going up to Johnson's bedroom proved they'd been in the house that night of the shooting. Before Jim Eady could even testify, the defense lawyers pleaded their clients guilty.
Well, thieves aren't that committed to doing a good job, as my experience, and they always make mistakes, and the mistakes tend to compound on each other, and I find that if I can see that in the crime scene, if I can spot those errors in the crime scene, then those are the opportunities, the windows of opportunity that I focus on to find good evidence.
Benedict and Lanou were sentenced to 6 years in the penitentiary. As for Alec Johnson, he would need years to recover from the brain damage from the shooting. This was a case where a dedicated forensic scientist stopped a couple of bad guys cold in their tracks.
The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Headlines called him evil, sick, a sex fiend and sexual predator, and proclaimed hell's too good for him. Janet meets him in the parking lot of the Humane Society, where she'd offered to become a volunteer. He asks for directions and starts talking about his dog. He introduces himself as Richard Wilde, says he's a film producer, and though he never does this, because she is so beautiful, he urges her to call his casting agent, Rachel. Janet is skeptical, but intrigued. She ends up leaving a message on the casting agency's answering machine. Rachel suggests meeting at a trendy downtown restaurant. Rachel looks like a model herself, and she's very friendly. She immediately tells Janet how beautiful she is. As they chat, she asks if Janet is married. Janet says she is and changes the subject. Because her husband's a police officer, she's very discreet about discussing it. Rachel says Richard can do a lot for her. Let's surprise him. All he's done all day is talk about you. Richard is delighted to see her. Because of their mutual love of animals, he tells her about the exotic pets he keeps in his basement. He seems to have money and know lots of showbiz people. Janet asks what they have in mind for her. Rachel and Richard say they see Janet starting out as an extra and working her way up from there. They toast to her future career. The next day, flowers arrive with a card that says, "You're stunning. Hope to see you soon, Richard." Rachel arranges a second meeting. She's brought along a red dress that she thinks will make Janet look glamorous and sexy. Instead, it makes Janet nervous. That night, though she's still checking them out, Janet has 2 glasses of wine. Towards midnight, Richard starts making cracks about people at other tables. A man who Richard claims is staring at them. A pregnant woman who's waddling to the washroom. When Richard offers another drink, Janet turns it down. She's getting fed up with them. She's sure they're up to something. She doesn't know what, but it doesn't seem legit. She decides she'll go home and have nothing more to do with these 2. But when she gets up to leave, she feels dizzy and disoriented. Once inside the car, all she wants is for the night to end. She tells them, "I want to go home. Take me home." But they don't. Though she doesn't know whose house it is, and this is not the kind of thing she would ever do, she follows them inside like a little puppy dog. This has got to be a dream, she thinks. I don't want to be here. Then all she can remember are a series of flashes. A camera. Rachel laughing. Richard trying to kiss her. Trying to fight him off. Then finding herself wearing the red dress from the car. Eventually, Richard drives her home. Janet's husband is waiting for her, worried sick. He asks where she's been, but she feels panicky and trapped. All she wants to do is sleep. The next day, she notices pubic hairs on her camisole. She knows they aren't hers or her husband's. Now she has to deal with the real possibility that she's been raped. One can only imagine how painful it must be for Janet, a cop's wife, to go to police with her story. Another woman has also complained about Richard Wilde, whose real name is Selva Sabaya. Thinking that it somehow involves prostitution, the case is assigned to the morality squad.
It was only after the interview we realized what this person was, this Richard Wilde, had nothing to do with prostitution, or at least we didn't think it did. We then believed it had something to do with drugging and sexual assault.
This is when forensic toxicology comes into it, a science as ancient as the Greeks. Originally used to study poisons, it now includes abuses of alcohol and drugs.
Yeah, the officers approached me and indicated that this fellow was committing sexual assaults on women and probably using drugs to do it. They wanted our laboratory to be able to establish what was the drug that Sabaya was using.
The problem is that by the time Steve Lintlop gets the sample of Janet's blood, it's a month after the assault.
An officer involved in the case came to me and indicated that they were going to create a sting to try and trap Sabaya. So it was quite exciting, quite different from the usual way a case unfolds in toxicology.
Police choose an undercover cop named Angela, who is Sabaya's type. Pretty, young, and white. Knowing the restaurant he frequents, they send her in. hoping to lure Sabaya.
She went in there, sat by herself, and from what we were able to gather, we had a good idea he would come to her, which he did.
There was a short conversation between the two of them where arrangements were made to meet the following night at the same bar at a certain time. We went back the following night. We had the officer in there. We had backup officers on the outside watching the premises. Sabaya showed up eventually, and he started with his spiel about into the movie producing commercials, etc. At some point, the officer's attention was distracted, and at that time, Sabaya slipped something inside her drink.
A short time later, Angela begins to feel some of the same effects Janet had: dizziness, heaviness, a dry mouth, and a rapid heartbeat. She calls for backup. Detectives appear. Sabaya and Rachel are taken in to be questioned. Angela is immediately rushed to a nearby hospital where samples are taken of her blood and urine. Steve Lintlop orders a series of low-tech tests to determine which drug or drugs, alone or with alcohol, would have produced the physical impairment and memory lapses experienced by Janet and Angela. Exhibit A, liquid in a drink.
Now, Sabaya was interested in producing a degree of sedation that would generate a willing partner for whatever he intended. There was history that suggested he was using Trazolam. One of the brand names for Trazolam is Halcyon, and it's a short-acting, very potent hypnotic. Mr. Sun, he's the head of our prep group. Actually, he is the prep group. I submitted the beverages to him and the glasses that the beverages came from. It should be, in theory, a fairly easy task for Mr. Sun to prove to us that Trazolam or some other drug was in there. He works his magic, he does his extractions, he runs his analysis, and it came back with caffeine and nothing else.
Police have a search warrant for Sabaya's house. A woman who identifies herself as Sabaya's wife lets them in. The search yields a range of drugs, including triazolam, and a copy of the CPS, a drug manual used by pharmacists. And 2 little black books.
This one here, basically it's names and phone numbers. A lot of the names in here, he's put a rating system on where he's scored women out of 10. And then a lot of the victims that he's gone through afterwards and drawn a line through the name, and they've been sexual assault victims.
We found a lot of Instamatic or 35mm photographs of women.
Often, as happened with Janet, the victims were shown photos of themselves undressed and or in sexually explicit positions.
They had no conscious memory of this taking place. They weren't aware of it. A lot of them denied that it was them that was in the picture.
Often using female accomplices, he posed as a film producer, modeling agent, lawyer, or diplomat to entice his victims. He boasted he'd been a dancer in Cats and in the video for Michael Jackson's Thriller. He'd take them to crowded downtown restaurants, places that seemed safe, and offer them drinks. Some would remember little of what happened during the next hours. What started out as 2 victims is mushrooming into hundreds. But why hadn't any of these women come forward?
In this type of scenario, victims often do feel that somehow they got conned into this. They should have known better. They had at the time they're thinking, geez, I must have had too much to drink and that kind of thing, and they somehow feel some personal responsibility. And Sabaya, I'm sure, was aware of this, because many of his victims for so long never reported this. So again, this was a ruse that was working for him, and if he was able to make these women feel this way, then again it helped him in having them not report these incidents to the police.
Investigators hope to have positive results from toxicology to strengthen their case against Sabaya. Since low-tech methods haven't yielded results, Steve Lintlob switches to high-tech methods, such as gas chromatography. The substance Steve Lintlob was testing for was extremely small.
A paperclip weighs half a gram. So most people know how much a paperclip weighs. They can visualize what a paperclip is. Well, can you imagine cutting a paperclip into 1 billion pieces, and we can see 5 of them?
Again, forensic toxicology comes up empty. Sabaya's pretrial is approaching. He is out on bail and still preying on unsuspecting victims. Low-tech hasn't worked. High-tech hasn't worked. Could the latest and most sophisticated testing apparatus available get results?
When we suspect or know that transylum is there, that requires its own specific method of extraction and its own specific instrumentation, and that is called GCMS, and that's mass spectrometry, which represents the state-of-the-art system we have for detecting and quantitating drugs at very low concentrations.
Again, forensic toxicology comes up empty. Despite this, there was enough evidence to convince a judge that Sabaya's case should go to trial. As for Sabaya's victims, they were humiliated, traumatized, and terrified. Many had been skeptical when they'd met him, but they reasoned they could always choose to leave if they ever felt uncomfortable. But when he drugged them, he took away their choice. As Janet lamented in her victim impact statement, "Even in my dreams, I feel as if I'm tied down and can't move, and he's skinning animals alive in front of me on the floor. He peels off the skin on their legs from top to bottom, and the animals are screaming."
Some of these women were so terrified of him. One put her daughter up for adoption, left Toronto, zigzagged across the country, bus, plane, train, to get away from him.
Many who were married are now divorced. If they had boyfriends, they're separated from their significant other. Some have never had relationships. Many are going for therapy and counseling. Some have attempted or thought of, certainly, suicide.
News of the trial brought forth more former victims. Her name was Karen Fallon. She was upstairs during many of Sabaya's sexual assaults. According to newspaper accounts, Sabaya charmed and married her so he could remain in Canada. A month into the relationship, he beat her for getting birthday flowers from another man. When she tried to defend herself, he made her sit on her hands. He told her it was a birthday she would never forget. Eventually, Sabaya had her working 88 hours a week at 2 jobs and giving him both paychecks. He even forced her to come to him for money to buy sanitary napkins. He also threatened to feed her to his exotic pets.
He had 2 freezers. And he'd open up the freezers and say, "This one is the horse meat. This one is the people that piss me off, so don't piss me off. Or I'll put you in there and you'll be fed to the animals."
He appeared to pretty much fit into what I would consider a classic power assertive rapist. These people usually have consensual sexual relationships with marital partners or other consensual partners, but that's not what their sexual fantasies involve. Their sexual fantasies involve non-consensual sex. And this is why some people, have this false interpretation that sex offenders are sex-starved, or if they only had a girlfriend, or if they only had a wife, that these crimes wouldn't be occurring. And I mean, people need to realize that sexual assault has very little to do with sex and everything to do with power and control, or in some cases exhibiting anger towards their victims, and sex is just the vehicle that that's acted out with.
Detectives had a mountain of other evidence. Polaroid photos of the victims in sexually explicit poses with Sabaya, modeling portfolios, his notebooks, and address books. But as for the undercover officer's blood and urine samples,
the only positive finding I had confidence in was that there was some alcohol in her urine, which was entirely consistent with drinking an alcoholic beverage during the sting. But as to assisting the prosecution in determining whether or not there was any illicit drug use, whether or not she had been doped by Sabaya or his accomplice, my findings were inconclusive.
Sabaya was charged with 274 counts, including sexual assault, administering a stupefying drug, assault causing bodily harm, and threatened death. What about Rachel, Sabaya's accomplice? One of the big reasons women trusted Sabaya was that he used her to approach his victims. Perhaps because Rachel's family was wealthy and would have mounted a formidable legal defense. Perhaps she was young. Whatever the reason, the case against her was dropped. Besides, Sabaya was the big fish. He agreed to plead guilty to 56 charges, just before his wife was scheduled to testify. Janet is now divorced. After giving investigators as much information as she could, she dropped out of sight, leaving no forwarding address, no way for anyone to get in touch. As for Sabaya, even in jail, he's been able to enlist new female accomplices to persuade other women to send him nude pictures of themselves, which he sells to other inmates for favors. Investigators have little power over his activities in jail. All they can do is make sure that in 1999, when he's eligible for parole, the parole board knows as much about him as possible, and that when he is released, he is deported immediately. As for toxicology, maybe the amount Angela consumed was too small to detect. Maybe it wasn't in that particular drink, and her reaction was psychosomatic. We'll never know.
All I could do was bring the full weight of our analytical systems to bear and hope they'll produce a positive result, and they didn't. Was I disappointed? Sure. But the question is, what do I do with my disappointment? And the answer is nothing. I write up the case, I send up my results, and it's up to other people to take that information forward.
Thanks to an exceptional investigative team and a group of courageous women, a pernicious sexual predator was apprehended and convicted. What's also significant is that forensic science retained its integrity even in the face of someone as deplorable as Selva Sabaya. The stories in Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real. Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. How much does science really know about sleep or dreaming, or how they intersect with our waking world? Exhibit A, the mystery of sleep. The last thing John Greer remembered was falling asleep watching Saturday Night Live. Then he had these weird flashes. His mother-in-law with a help me look on her face. Yelling, "Kids, kids," trying to warn them about something. The sound of a phone beeping off the hook. Then coming awake in his car and seeing a bloody knife beside him. If this was a nightmare, he desperately wanted to wake up. Then the horror dawned on him. He drove to the nearest police station where he blurted out, "Oh my God, I think I just killed 2 people." The police sped to his in-laws. They found John's father-in-law still alive with serious knife wounds to his back and head. His mother-in-law had been stabbed 5 times and hit with a tire iron. An hour later, John's wife, Lisa, is awakened by 2 police officers. They break the news that her mother has been murdered and that her husband is the murderer. It doesn't make any sense to her. In the 6 years she'd known John, he never once showed any violent tendencies. They had met in high school. She was a rebellious teenager, and he encouraged her to reconcile with her folks, especially her mother. To John, Lisa's parents were like the Brady Bunch, the family he always wished he had. And he'd always been particularly close to her mother. It just didn't make any sense. When Lisa finally brings herself to visit John in jail, she expects answers. Why did he attack them? Why did he drive 20 minutes in the middle of the night to her parents' home? What happened? John can't answer any of it. Even his severely damaged hands are a mystery. Lisa leaves angry and confused. From this point on, there would always be 2 juries judging John, the one in the courtroom and the one in his wife's heart. He resigned himself to this inevitable fate, a divorce from Lisa and a conviction for first-degree murder. The attack didn't sound like something John would do. Not to John's grandmother. So she hired John, one of the best criminal lawyers in the country, Marlis Edward.
He was deeply sad, tearful, and he was very clear that he did not remember. He did not understand what had happened. He did not know if he was responsible for the death of his mother-in-law and the severe stabbing of and wounding of his father-in-law. So really all he could say in the most compelling of ways was, "I'm confused, I'm frightened, I don't know why I'm here, I've damaged my hands." His hands were very badly injured by obviously handling a knife of some kind, and I don't know what happened.
Why was his memory so sketchy about such a horrendous attack? Was he faking? Or was it some form of temporary insanity? She called Ronald Billings, an expert in forensic psychiatry.
I was puzzled because he was depressed, but he was depressed because of what happened. There was no evidence of any kind of delusional thinking, and he didn't have a long history of antisocial behavior, and he was not an aggressive person. His nickname was the Gentle Giant. So there was nothing. There was nothing. He didn't show there was no personality disorder. He wasn't a psychopath. It was just a puzzle.
Meanwhile, the police had a strong case. His father-in-law could identify John as the attacker. They had also found the murder weapon in John's car. And they had his confession when he entered the police station. Then what would explain the attack?
I looked to some external circumstances that would give clues. And one of them is the absence of any motive. I mean, there was no insurance policy, there was no money, there's no anger, and you can't find a reason. And we found, I think, a clue, and a very important clue that started to move us in direction of exploring sleep disorders, when we received from the Crown a copy of his statement to the police. In our law, we provide for, and it's rarely been successful, a defense of non-insane automatism. Sleepwalking is one variety of that.
Sleepwalking. Many of her colleagues found it far-fetched, others ridiculous. A jury would never believe it. Nobody would. Would you? Marlis Edward wanted to know as much as she could about sleepwalking. Searching for an expert, she found one close to home, Roger Broughton. Marlis got permission for Broughton to set up a temporary sleep lab in a parole office. Technicians would monitor John's brainwaves, eye movements, muscle tone, and blood oxygen.
There are two qualitatively different types of sleep. The first type we refer to usually as non-REM sleep or synchronized sleep or sometimes quiet sleep. And the other type we refer to as rapid eye movement sleep or REM sleep, also called paradoxical sleep and active sleep. There are significant differences between these two types of sleep, which are really as different from each other as either is from wakefulness.
Sleepwalking occurs in deep sleep, the lowest of the 4 levels of non-REM sleep.
In normal subjects, when we study their sleep, they very rarely go from the deepest stages of non-REM sleep, from what we've called slow-wave sleep, to wakefulness. It's quite rare.
Dr. Broughton observes John Greer immediately sinks down to level 4, deep sleep, then suddenly shifts to wakefulness without passing through any of the other 3 levels. 1 or 2 such shifts per night is usual.
Here in this first study, he had, I think it was 4 or 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, so 4 here. So this is fairly characteristic of sleepwalkers.
Experts believe sleepwalking is an incomplete arousal from sleep. The person has their eyes open, but they're like a robot, carrying out some deeply embedded internal program. That's why sleepwalking is often made up of familiar actions. There was a man who used to cook entire meals while asleep. He would grunt like an animal at these times, and his family learned not to wake him because he would become aggressive. In the morning, the man could never remember any of it. Not only was the man a sleepwalker, but his children and grandchildren had a high incidence of sleepwalking. In fact, when his grandson was 6, he tried to climb out a 6th-floor window in his sleep. The sleepwalking cook was John's maternal grandfather. The grandson who tried to climb out the 6th-floor window was none other than John Greer himself.
He also had other sleep disorders which frequently cluster with sleepwalking, which include sleep terrors, of which he had in the past, sleep talking to a certain extent, and a pattern of very deep sleep.
So personal circumstances and family history are 2 of the preconditions of sleepwalking. Others are stress and exhaustion. To understand how these might have had an influence on John, defense scrutinized the days leading up to the murder. John and Lisa had married in their teens. Within 2 years, they'd saved enough to buy a car and put a down payment on a house. Life was great. Then one weekend, they went with another couple to the Queen's Plate. John's horse won and paid $45. John thought he had the knack. He knew Lisa dreamed of going to Australia. He thought he'd play the horses just until he won enough to send her there. Within a year, his dream became a nightmare. He started losing, then stealing small amounts from his employer to cover his losses. In time, he embezzled $32,000 and was caught, fired, and charged with theft. He spent a night in jail. Lisa and her folks stuck by him. No one would hire him. With Lisa pregnant with their first child, and to stem her financial anxieties, he lied that he had gotten a job. Then he started playing the horses again, believing somehow that he could win enough to repay his employer and bail himself out of trouble. This time, when he started losing, he borrowed from loan sharks and stole from his wife's bank account. The murder had taken place on Saturday night. The pressure began building that Thursday. That's when Lisa was notified that one of her checks had bounced. Assuming it was a mistake, she inquired at the bank. They showed her a stack of checks with her signature. With a sickening feeling, she realized they'd been forged by John. That night, she screamed at John and banished him from their bedroom. He couldn't sleep that night. Then on Friday, Lisa discovered he'd been lying about having a job and that they were more in debt than she'd imagined. She had never been so angry. Alone, he couldn't stop worrying that she'd leave and take their new baby. And he couldn't blame her. He couldn't sleep that night either. On Saturday, after being awake 48 straight hours, he played rugby, hoping it would make him tired enough to fall asleep. When Lisa came home from work, he expected she would demand a divorce. Instead, she told him they'd sell the house, repay his employer, and start all over again. John couldn't believe it. He would have to come clean with her parents. That would be one of the hardest things he'd ever have to do. He feared he'd lose their love and respect. But if that was the price of keeping his marriage together, he'd do it. That night, Lisa asked him if he was coming upstairs to bed. He said he'd sleep downstairs until all of this was behind him. As he settled down to watch the end of Saturday Night Live, he believed they'd weathered the storm. But if life up until now had been a nightmare, it was to become a living hell. When John Greer fell asleep that night, he'd been awake for 60 hours. 60 hours reliving the awful events of the past 3 days. 60 bleary hours of agonizing stress. So yes, on the night of the murder, John Greer was a prime candidate for sleepwalking. But would a jury believe it? Would they believe that he had driven 20 minutes on a superhighway and committed 2 ghastly attacks while sleepwalking? Exhibit A, to sleep, perchance to sleepwalk. The judge in this case had 3 questions for the jury to decide. Did John Greer cause the death of his mother-in-law? And if he did, were the acts causing the death conscious and voluntary? And if the acts were not conscious and voluntary, what crime was committed?
We knew we had to put forward a thorough and exhaustive case, one that would convince a rational person so that, they wouldn't walk away saying, this is ridiculous, this is incredible. It had to be, you know, enough evidence that 12 ordinary people in the community would look at it and say, this is the only explanation.
John's final thoughts before falling asleep that fateful Saturday night might have been filled with anxiety about meeting the next day with his in-laws. Deep in sleep, an hour or two later, which is when most sleepwalking occurs, he might have started acting out the next day's events. How else to explain why he left the house without socks or underwear? The first time he'd ever done that. Or why he'd left the front door wide open. Another thing he'd never done before. Then he started driving on a superhighway to his in-laws, a route he'd driven hundreds of times. Is driving a more complex action than John's grandfather's cooking entire meals? No one could be absolutely positive about the next events. How John got in is not clear. One could imagine his mother-in-law seeing him at 4 in the morning and trying to figure out what was going on. Perhaps, as happens with sleepwalkers, she'd physically tried to get his attention and he became aggressive. Terrified, she might have run into the kitchen and tried the phone, which didn't work because the extension had been knocked off the hook. Perhaps that's when she reached for the knife. John's father-in-law testified that he woke up with John choking him. He hadn't remembered John saying anything before he blacked out. Perhaps that's when John's mother-in-law returned and John had taken the knife from her, blade first, which is how his hands got cut to the bone. Perhaps that's when he had his flash of her face with the help me expression, before he attacked her with the knife. Around that time, one of the girls came out onto the landing and called out to see what was going on. The girls testified they heard grunting. John's grandfather used to grunt when he cooked in his sleep. Then he remembered coming awake and seeing the bloody knife next to him. More time had elapsed since he'd left the house than most sleepwalking incidents. Then there was his confusion at the police station when he blurted out, "My God, I've just killed 2 people with my hands." Then he added, "I killed them. I don't know why." By the time Marlis Edward presented her case in court, 4 other psychiatrists testified that John Greer was sleepwalking when he stabbed his mother-in-law to death. In an emotional victory, Lisa finally believed. But even if he was sleepwalking, was he still guilty of first-degree murder? Had he programmed himself while awake to kill his mother-in-law in his sleep?
There's no evidence that one can create a motivation in wakefulness as a sleepwalker in a way that would carry over in sleepwalking.
Marlis Edward argued that yes, John Greer had caused his mother-in-law's death, but that neither a first or second-degree murder or manslaughter charge applied. Since the prosecution had failed to present beyond a reasonable doubt that John's actions were voluntary and conscious. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. When the judge asked, "Members of the jury, have you agreed upon your verdict?" the jury foreman stood up and replied, "We find him not guilty." Greer was free.
I was committed to a person who I believed if he had been convicted, would have been wrongly convicted. And that in itself is the real benefit and the real joy of doing criminal defense work, when you think you get the right result and the just result.
He and Lisa tried to put their shattered lives back together again. but after a few years, they file for divorce. As far as is known, John Greer had never again acted violently in his sleep. Was it a freak of nature? A 1 in a billion occurrence?
I think we're all uncomfortable with the idea that that we or another person could have complex behavior of which we're unaware and which is out of our or the person's control.
We tend to think if we understand something, it's no longer a mystery. But with sleep and its disorders, the more we understand, the more mysterious it becomes. The stories in Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real. Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Beginning an investigation with a single body part is like beginning a jigsaw puzzle with a single piece. But that's how the following case began. Exhibit A. A human leg extending from just above the ankle to just above the knee washed ashore an hour from Niagara Falls. Police are called, and they in turn call in a forensic pathologist. The pathologist in this case has performed some 8,000 autopsies, but this will be his most memorable.
It was a large leg, appeared to be from a large individual. It was obviously a white person, and it was covered in algae and beach sand and debris and so on. There were no injuries that I could see, and it had been pretty cleanly severed at each end, but I couldn't tell whether it was male or female.
Police suspect that the limb is from a man who committed suicide off a nearby bridge, and the cleanly severed limb is probably the result of a passing ship's propeller. In any unexplained death, pathologists hope to answer 4 questions. First and foremost, the identity of the deceased. Second, time of death. Third, place of death. Fourth,
the death has to be categorized. In other words, is this a death due to natural causes, an accidental death, suicide, or homicide, or finally, if it's not possible to determine which of those it is, it's classified as undetermined.
Given that the suicide occurred the month before, this also fits with Dr. King's observations about the leg.
It was well preserved, and I thought probably that it may only have been in the water maybe a matter of days or a month or two.
If the leg is the jumper's, Dr. King is well on his way to answering the 4 questions. But if things were that straightforward, we wouldn't be telling you this story. One of the first things Dr. King does is send the leg to a colleague who specializes in analyzing bones to determine age, stature, and gender. Using calipers, she takes various measurements of the bone.
The big challenge in this case was that the remains were so fragmentary. All we had was a partial leg. When you're trying to get a lot of information from just a couple of parts of long bones, it's difficult. You're just looking at a small portion of the skeleton alone to try to reconstruct the individual's characteristics.
With a pelvic bone, determining gender is roughly 95% accurate. With a skull, around 80%. But with just a leg bone, accuracy drops off sharply.
The measurements of the long bones from parts of the shafts and around the knee joint fell within the male range and outside the range for female measurements based on the reference standards. So it would indicate the individual was a male.
Based on this, the leg is sent back to Dr. King, identified as John Doe. That's when things take an interesting turn in the autopsy room. Detectives from nearby Toronto are investigating a missing person, a 6-foot prison guard named Louisa Barston.
What happens when a body or a body part is found, there's a message goes out to all police agencies. So we went down just to sort of take a look and see if it could have any connection with our case. We felt it was a woman's leg, even though it was big. You know, as big as what you'd expect a 6-foot man's leg to be.
Given this, Dr. King re-examines the leg.
I noticed that it was not a very hairy leg. There were in fact relatively few hairs on the leg. They were very fine and very short, and suggested to me that these were most probably hairs that one would see on a female leg.
John Doe could be Jane Doe. But did the leg come from the missing woman? Louisa's husband, Henry Barston, a police sergeant, had reported that she'd gone missing more than a month before. The Barstons had already been touched by tragedy when their eldest son, Patrick, had been killed in an accident. That's when their grandson, Tim, had come to live with them. According to Henry Barston, on the morning of Louisa's disappearance, Tim left for school as usual. But an argument erupted about how she had disciplined the boy for wetting his bed. The argument continued as they headed for Toronto. The closer they got to downtown, the more it seemed to escalate. At a red light, it exploded. What happened next would haunt him in the days that followed. Previously, when they argued, Louisa had gone to a girlfriend's for a couple of days. So Henry wasn't overly concerned when she didn't come back the next day. When Tim asked about her on the third day, Henry reassured him everything would be okay. But he confided to Tim's teacher at a parent-teacher meeting that Louisa had a suicidal fascination with Niagara Falls. After she'd been missing for 19 days, Henry reported it to the police.
It didn't give me the impression of what normally happens with a missing person. And the family had reported that she had left, you know, for a few days before, but always contacted a member of the family and said, you know, I'm here, I'm there, whatever. And that hadn't happened. It was just a complete disappearance. It's very unusual for somebody just to disappear instantly. There's usually a trail to be followed unless the person is dead.
Had Louisa Barston committed suicide, and had the Falls hydroelectric turbine severed her leg? It was an examination of how the leg had been severed that blew the case wide open.
Well, 7 months before, I had been working on the dismembered remains of Leslie Mahaffey, and we'd spent quite a long time working on that case, examining severed body parts, and particularly saw marks through bone. These are the cut ends of the two bones in the lower leg, just above the ankle. And I think you can see on the hard bone, the compact bone, saw marks.
He now had an answer to question 4, the category of death.
This is obviously not suicide, and the body being dismembered by the screw of a large ship. There's obviously foul play involved.
The fact that Barston waited 19 days before reporting his wife missing troubled Tony Warr.
I'm sure you've experienced where you've met somebody that, for some reason, and you don't know why, You may cause the hair on the back of your neck to stand up because you don't know why.
The person who was causing the hair on the back of Tony War's neck to stand up was another cop, Henry Barston. What happens when a cop investigates another cop?
The fact that it was a serving police officer on our service would cause us to be very guarded about the progress of the investigation. And people working on the investigation were instructed not to talk outside of the investigation. It made life a little difficult because we weren't able to go to our usual, resource, which is 5,000 to 6,000 people we have, working with us. We can't go to that resource so easily because we have to be careful that information might get back to our suspect.
Tony War started by reviewing Barston's original statement.
I've conducted several investigations that have started as a missing person. You investigate the circumstances as they are reported to you, and usually you find there's discrepancies or there's a hole in the story, basically, that just doesn't make any sense. And that's where you zero in and try and find contrary evidence to prove that the account given by whoever's reporting it is not correct.
Tony War zeroed in on the alleged story about the smashed window. According to Henry Barston, they had argued about their grandson's bedwetting. It came to a head when they stopped downtown for a red light. But had the window really been broken that way?
When we're talking about when they parted company, that to me was fabricated. But if you could look at a videotape of that interview, you would see a marked change in the way the conversation was going when we're talking about things that were insignificant or things that actually happened, and into the area where when she disappeared, that did not happen.
It's just as important to disprove as it is to prove something. So for 2 weeks, police hand out flyers at the same street corner at the same time of day to see if anyone can corroborate Henry Barston's story. No one claims to have witnessed it. Nonetheless, Henry's car window had been broken. Investigators interview the garage mechanic who fixed it. He expresses doubt that anyone but Superman could have broken the window using only their fist.
But there had to have been a reason to explain the fact that that window was broken. So that was a trigger to me that we got to find out, why did that window break? And when did it break? Because that's an important part of the story.
Around this time, investigators get a call from one of Henry Barston's neighbors. She claims that on the night Louisa Barston supposedly disappeared, she saw someone toss a large bundle into the trunk of a car. Under hypnosis, she identifies the man as Henry Barston. Police question Barston again, and this time ask him to bring in his car. In an aside, he mentions he's been having trouble with his grandson playing with matches. The next day when Barston brings his car in, it smells of smoke. According to Barston, his grandson Tim had set the fire. Police question Tim, who tells them he had promised his grandmother he'd never play with matches.
We were able to seize the car, and our examination of the car, we found that there was a deliberate attempt to burn the car. It wasn't damaged that badly. We found a makeshift wick stuffed in the back seat, and it obviously appeared that whoever set the fire wanted the fire to burn into the trunk, because the curled up piece of paper led into the trunk. So that sort of zeroed our attention to the trunk.
At the Center of Forensic Sciences, the entire trunk lid is removed and brought into the lab to be examined. The trunk had been scrubbed clean, but using special lighting, Keith Kelder finds specks of blood not visible to the naked eye against the maroon paint. He collects the minute droplets and sends them upstairs to Pam Newell. She has already received samples of the leg's bone and deep muscle tissue from Dr. King to determine its DNA.
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and it's the chemical blueprint of life. It's the map that defines who you are, who I am, and makes us different from everyone else in this world, with the single exception of our identical twin, should we have one. We ran the blood from the trunk of the car in the lane beside the extracted DNA from the leg, and we found that the profile from the trunk of the car matches the DNA profile from the leg.
It now has to be compared to Louisa Barston, but no sample of the dead woman's DNA exists. Without definitive proof, the prosecution's case will be severely weakened. Then something else happened that threatened to totally derail the case. A Transit Commission employee said she witnessed a domestic argument at the place and time in question, and that the woman had yelled at the driver and punched the window.
Well, that stunned us initially because we were, whoa. Everything we got so far says this didn't happen, and now we've got an eyewitness who says they saw it happen.
Suddenly, the pieces no longer fit. Henry Barston had an alibi. Tony Warr spent frustrating hours and days investigating the transit employee's story. Eventually, he found transit records that proved that she was actually driving a subway train at the time, and that she'd simply been mistaken about the day and the couple. But given that the only witness was also their only suspect, Tony Warr had a problem proving exactly how Louisa Barston had been killed.
We had a difficulty in that we had no cause of death, and we had no body. All we had was a body part that we could link to the car, and we could link to her, of course. But we had no killing scene, no cause of death. Very, very hard to prove that a person's killed if you can't show how they died.
The case will be weak unless investigators can establish with greater certainty that the leg and the blood in the car are Louisa Barston's. That's when Pam Newell took center stage.
Every person inherits half of their DNA from their mother and half of their DNA from their father. And that's because half of the DNA is contained in the ovum, and the other half of the DNA is contained in the spermatozoa. And they're one half of each of the pairs of chromosomes that make up your complete complement of chromosomes. And when that ovum is fertilized by the spermatozoa, that is the first cell of that new child. And that cell divides, becomes a human being. The DNA in each cell of that human being is the same as the DNA that was established when the spermatozoa fertilized the ovum.
So Pam Newell asked Tony Warr to get blood samples from Louisa's family. He sent officers to France to obtain samples from Louisa's mother and sister. And he asked the Barstons' other son for a sample. Henry Barston had already given police a blood sample after one of his interviews. By determining each family member's DNA and charting the relationship between them, she could figure out Louisa Barston's DNA. Then she compared it to the DNA of the leg and the blood found on the trunk of Barston's car. It matches.
The frequency of occurrence of this composite profile of the leg, which matches the composite profile of the blood from the trunk, is very rare, with, I believe, a frequency of less than 1 in 700 million.
Police now arrested Henry Barston for his wife's murder. But investigators still couldn't prove how Henry Barston had killed his wife, or whether the killing had been premeditated or accidental. With such a slender case, Barston's lawyer was allowed to plea bargain the charge to manslaughter, on condition Barston tell them about the killing. They had argued about Tim's bedwetting. He tried to walk away. But she was in his face, and he was next to his service revolver. He later claimed he didn't remember how many times he shot her. He cut her up with a hacksaw, then put plastic down in the trunk. Then he had a sickening realization that he had left his only set of keys in the car. Now Tony War had an explanation for the window. Barston had dumped Louisa's body into Lake Ontario and made up the story about her fascination with Niagara Falls.
And there's no way of knowing whether that's what actually happened or if some other series of events occurred that resulted in the same end.
Henry Barston had allegedly said he would rather spend 5 years in jail than 15 years married to his wife. He was sentenced to 10 years in jail. He got out in 4.
It's been my experience when investigating police officers that they're not good at it, because they're used to having their word accepted. They're used to having, whatever they relate accepted, and they're not that good at covering their tracks.
As in many crimes, Louisa Barston wasn't the only victim. Tim has been passed around among relatives in foster homes.
They lost a son tragically a number of years ago, and I don't think that their relationship recovered from that. And I think that's what caused them to sort of come apart.
Whereas in most cases, it would have ended in divorce, this one ended in murder. In the end, detectives and forensic scientists were able to piece together a human tragedy from a single bone and solve a puzzling murder. Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. A perfect crime is like a perfect mystery. Only the criminal, the mastermind, knows how it was done. Exhibit A, the charred remains of a lottery ticket. The way Guido tells it, any good Samaritan would have done the same thing. The fire could have easily gotten out of control. He'd been going through rough times lately, but maybe good luck shines on the good. How else to explain why he even picked up the charred lottery ticket covered with gunk? It was from a draw 2 months earlier. When he got home, out of curiosity, he checked the winning numbers in old newspapers. He couldn't believe it. He'd hit the special bonus, worth $100,000. But when Guido goes to collect his prize, The woman in charge, Louise Ng, is suspicious. She asks him why the ticket is damaged. He explains how he found it and adds, maybe the original owner threw it out, not realizing he could still make out the bonus number. She tells Guido they'll have to check out the ticket and get back to him. How long will it take? She says about a week. He has no choice but to wait. The Lottery Corporation wants to know if the ticket has been altered, changed, or transformed in any way. So they send it to the company that printed it, which in turn sends it to their head office in Atlanta. The Atlanta company has their lab examine the ticket and sends back a letter stating they have no reason to suspect it isn't authentic. But when Guido comes back, Louise Ng still won't release the prize money. She's one of those bureaucrats who treats the money as if it's their own. Guido feels it's unfair, but what can he do? After he leaves, she takes it upon herself to call the anti-racket squad. Looking into Guido's past, investigators find he has a clean record. He's never been in trouble. His foreman and other workers say he's a straight-up guy. One of their officers hand delivers the ticket to the Center of Forensic Sciences. The documents section examines any kind of writings, whether by hand or by machine, in which authenticity is in question. This can include numbers, letters, drawings, everything from wills and passports to credit cards and diplomas, and even the graffiti on a bathroom wall.
I was presented with this ticket and it was covered, the whole ticket actually, not this area up here, but particularly this suspect area around the number. I was asked, was this number in any way changed or altered? Were any of the numbers what they should not be? And I looked at it under the microscope and I couldn't get a good look at any of these digits. So I asked for permission to remove the obliterating material. It was kind of, it was a thick acrylic type stuff and a lot of dirt, pebbles and stones was in this whole area here.
Dawson sends the ticket to the chemistry section.
I think the main reason why the other labs didn't want to do the work because it's delicate and they were afraid, well, we might damage the ticket ourselves, you know, and then the Lottery Corporation would not have any other choice, you know, but to pay out.
Guido returned a third time, determined not to take no for an answer. But Louise Ng is equally determined not to pay until she's totally satisfied. Steve Pausak put the gunk-covered ticket under a stereo microscope. But like many other discoveries in science, he was about to be aided by luck. As he goes to adjust the focus, his hand momentarily moves in front of one of the two lights, creating a one-sided beam. In that instant, he notices a thin line next to one of the ones. In order to examine it further, he'll have to remove the glue and gunk covering the ticket.
The glue was, at this point, was probably about 1.5 millimeter thick, and it contained at least 2 layers.
He uses chloroform to thin the glue. It takes days to get through all the layers without damaging the ticket. Finally, he can clearly see a little piece of paper stuck onto the main body of the ticket. The two ones are next to each other. They have slightly different fonts, one of the ones having been cut from another ticket.
When I realized eventually from the moment I seen this sharp line close to the digit 1, I was convinced at that moment that it's forged.
Guido had played the lottery and missed $100,000 by one number. Over the next weeks, he experimented with cutting and gluing pieces of tickets together, burning them in a controlled way, and camouflaging them with layers of glue and gunk. Then he made up the story about the fire.
The fellow who did this alteration was very careful. I mean, that's a very delicate cut. He never went through the entire thickness of this lottery ticket. He only got the surface. So, I mean, this was a very delicate cut that he would have had to have made in there, and must have had a microscope and a very sharp razor blade to do it, and then to peel it back very, very carefully. And then cut another one, get a number one from another lottery ticket, make the same cut, and then physically sink it right into the exact spot. It would have been, he did a very precise and careful job. But without all of the glue and the gunk on top, it still would have been quite clear that it had been added.
Guido is arrested and charged with conspiring to commit fraud. When the case came to trial, the defense argues that Guido had never been in trouble before. He'd simply gotten a ticket that was one number away from a dream, and that the temptation to make it come true was just too great. When we come back, another fascinating case where the examination of a document would be the difference between a dream and a clever scheme. Our second Exhibit A. An ordinary-looking check. It doesn't appear suspicious in any way, and yet it almost succeeded in being the perfect crime. Friday night at a big downtown bank. Just before closing. A new teller named Maria Talbert is trying to do her best. But her boss is anxious to leave. Her last customer wants to do an interbranch transfer. At least, that's what she claimed. But the following Monday morning, before the bank opens, Maria's boss starts tearing a strip off her. He demands an explanation for the check she left to be processed the previous Friday night. Her ledger has it marked down for $7,106, but the check only reads $106. Maria seems stunned. In a voice choked with emotion, she tries to explain what she remembers about the transaction. He was the last customer of the day, and he wanted to transfer money from his account at another branch into his account at this branch. Everyone seems so impatient to leave that she decides to wait till Monday to do the paperwork. And she's positive the amount was for more than $7,000. But the check clearly reads $106. The manager thinks that Maria and the customer are in cahoots and that they've stolen the $7,000 difference. It's fraud. But the manager doesn't want trouble, and he knows the bank doesn't want bad publicity. So he makes what he thinks is a generous offer. If Maria immediately tenders her resignation, he won't call in the police. But Maria is indignant. She can't explain it, but she swears she did nothing wrong. She brazenly tells her boss to go right ahead and call in the police.
I dreaded fraud occurrences. I mean, when I was a uniform officer, you get the call to the store or the bank, and you know, see Mr. Jones regarding a fraud. You go, oh God, you know, give me a bank robbery, or give me a, you know, break and enter, or, you know, get me off this call. I didn't understand the process. I didn't understand the banking process and clearing houses and debits and credits and all the rest of it. I basically sat with the supervisor. I said, hold it. I got to know what happened here. Tell me, explain to me.
What impresses the investigating officer is that the young woman is so adamant. Normally, he wouldn't involve forensics on something like this because it's small potatoes. But he has a feeling about this one. Once again, it ends up on Greg Dawson's desk.
If it's suspected that a document has been altered or changed in some way, a person has to have done something to that to create the change. And I would examine it using just my handheld magnifying glass and look closely at the suspect areas, or even at the entire document for any paper fiber disturbance or discoloration.
Dawson examines it under a microscope.
I'm looking for anything on the check that would direct my attention, that shows it to be suspicious in any way. Is there any alteration to it? Is there any discoloration? Is the check properly made through a printer, or has it been created on its own?
Erasures leave telltale signs that show up clearly under a microscope. Sometimes a document looks perfectly normal until you change the angle of the light. This Exhibit A was subjected to all these tests and nothing. Maybe it's not surprising. I could imagine how you could change this, but how could you alter this to read 7,000?
When I went through it and did all these examinations, particularly the physical ones, it was absolutely clean. There's no indication. In fact, I looked at it and thought there's no room to write 7,000 on the amount line of this particular document. And I thought it just seems impossible for that to be.
I guess Maria was lying. But wait a sec. Sometimes a document has been altered not by erasing something, but by adding something. Dawson tries one other test. He floods the check with ultraviolet light.
And that clearly showed that the 70 was there. And the number 7 was in front.
Maria had been telling the truth. The customer, Brian Hennessy, was the thief. Somehow, he'd handed in a check on Friday for $7,106. But by Monday, it only read $106.
Well, you'd have the bank here, which we'll call Bank A. And the suspect in this case had a bank account at this bank. Down the street 3 or 4 blocks, he had another bank, which we'll refer to as Bank B. And he also had a bank account at this bank as well. Well, as it was explained to me, he came into this bank on a Friday afternoon and attempted to deposit the check. And the idea was that at the end of the banking day, all the checks would be collected. Now, these would be checks coming in from individuals, deposits made by businesses, and so on. They go to what they refer to as the clearinghouse. And there the checks are sorted out and then sent on to the various banks. So the idea was that he would deposit his check to this bank for $7,106. But by the time the check ended back up here, it was only $106.
And to make it absolutely perfect, the bank would have routinely returned the canceled check, so Hennessy could have destroyed the only evidence. Who knows how many times Hennessy had worked this before? What foiled it this time was Maria, unsure of how to process the check. She held on to it until Monday. Now, all police have to do is nab Hennessy and charge him with fraud, right? They can easily prove the check had been altered. The question is, how? Because any decent defense lawyer could claim that an ordinary guy like Hennessy couldn't possibly have the skill to magically alter the numbers on a check between Friday night and Monday morning.
I know that all indelible inks, there's nothing you can add to them to make them disappear on their own, particularly with not leaving a trace. Now, you can bleach ink out, but this is safety paper on a check, and it's designed to show any kind of change or alteration to it. It's quite readily evident.
Forensic science would have to figure out exactly how he'd done it, and it wasn't going to be easy. Dawson started with the premise that Hennessy had made his own ink. You're probably thinking, how hard can it be to make ink? I mean, ink is just blue stuff, right? It's a good thing they have experts solving this. But even they were stumped.
I didn't know what kind of product the person could have used. Who could have composed their own ink formulation to do this? You'd have to know an awful lot about chemistry and the ink industry. You'd have to, and I know that that inks are made indelible, so they cannot be changed. Regardless of what you add to it, the change that you want to make will be evident. I didn't know. I simply didn't know, and I just asked chemistry if they would happen to know, and nobody there knew.
At the end of a frustrating week, Dawson arrives home to see his brother-in-law ambushed by his kids with a water gun full of ink. He is not amused until the ink suddenly begins to fade. The water guns have been filled with disappearing ink, the kind you might get at a joke store. Dawson realized he'd been working on the problem backwards. Instead of finding a way to make commercial ink disappear, he needed to find a way to make disappearing ink last longer. Joke store ink is basically an acid-based indicator known as thymolphthalene.
It was thymolphthalene that was the active ingredient, and it's quite innocuous. But he also found out that if you increase the pH of that ink just slightly, you can make it last for a longer period of time.
And how might Hennessy have changed the pH balance? Easy. With one of the main ingredients in household drain cleaners. By varying the pH balance, the ink could be made to stay visible for periods from minutes to days. Then just by coming into contact with carbon dioxide in the air, it would vanish.
So the trick here was for him to add just the right concentration, and he would have had to have done a lot of experimenting to find out exactly what concentration to add to make it last only 48 hours. He doesn't want it to last for a whole week. It certainly has to last more than one day, but to find the right concentration, and that's what he did.
Hennessy had probably learned about inks the last time he'd been in jail. The prison he'd been in had state-of-the-art printing equipment and had brought in experts to teach the inmates skills. Plus, prisoners have plenty of time on their hands to think up perfect crimes.
The supervisor explained to us later that had the check been deposited, it probably would have never been discovered. In the due process, when books were balanced between banks, this particular bank would have been out $7,000 and never know what happened to it.
Gary Hennessy was apprehended and charged with fraud. At his trial, Hennessy pleaded guilty, no contest, and was sentenced to 2 years less a day. Nearly the perfect crime. But due to an inquisitive cop and a tireless forensic scientist, an innocent teller was cleared and a clever culprit caught by this. An Exhibit A that just wouldn't disappear. The stories in Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The stories in Exhibit A are based on actual cases.